Well, Canadian retailers got another reality check last week when Nordstrom announced a winding down of its Canadian operations. Of course, it's not the first time in recent history big box retailers have stopped doing business in this country. Target's Canadian segment collapsing in 2015. Lowe's struggling before selling its Canadian division earlier this year. And to make sense of the retail landscape, let's bring in Mark Cohen. He's former CEO of Sears Canada and Director of Retail Studies at Columbia Business School. Mark, nice to have you back with us.
You bet. Good seeing you.
What went through your mind when we saw this news about Nordstrom leaving Canada after big expectations just a few years ago?
Well, I wasn't surprised. First of all, Nordstrom has been struggling in the U.S. for the past several years. The pandemic, which obviously affected everyone on the planet, certainly had an impact upon them that they've struggled to overcome. And so that speaks poorly for their foray across the border. And then, of course, I thought from the very beginning that they opened too many stores. You know, the 6 stores that they opened had formerly been Sears Canada stores. So I knew the locations, and I certainly know Nordstrom's to a great degree. And I felt as if 3 of those locations were likely bullseyes, 3 not so much, and so that they threw the towel in, frankly, just didn't surprise me.
Well, and obviously strategy plays a role. There are some perhaps larger factors, including the pandemic, that are out of the control of just about every retailer. Is there anything they could have done differently that might have netted them different results so we weren't having this conversation in the first place?
Well, first off, most retailers who cross a border, whether they're U.S. retailers, Canadian retailers, European retailers, or Asian retailers, struggle. In fact, I would be willing to bet most attempts to globalize either fail or turn out to be something far less than had been expected. So right out of the gate, you're facing a very high bar that you have to be able to hurdle. What could they have done? Well, they could have opened a store in Vancouver, which is where their brand equity was probably most available to them because of cross-border shopping from British Columbia into their home state of Washington. They could have stuck to Vancouver, possibly Ottawa, and Yorkdale, which is where I think their customer profile best matches the Canadian marketplace in those locations. And they could have taken the 4, 5, or 6 years it takes to build a brand equity that you'd like to think exists because you'd like to think everybody knows your name, but that's rarely, if ever, the case.
You know, you made that point about the fact that once you cross a border, as much as I highlighted these examples of U.S. players coming to Canada and what message that sends about the challenges in the Canadian market, that you have a lot of challenges anytime you set foot outside your home market. Can you walk us through some of the other examples out there? I mean, even the mighty Walmart has had stumbles globally.
Well, right out of the gate, the presumption that Western Canada is English-speaking and therefore no big deal is a misnomer because the language has significant idiomatic differences between U.S. and Canada. And it's not in-your-face differences as it would be, for instance, with regard to Quebec, but it's insidious and it has to be overcome. But the biggest issue between U.S. and Canada, my experience, is that the U.S. and Canada have more or less the same landmass, but Canada only has, less than 40 million Canadians, whereas the U.S. is a market well over 300 million. And so your distance between marketplaces, between customers from wherever you're shipping goods, whether it be to your stores or your shipping via e-commerce, is enormously different, and therefore your costs are enormously different. The composition of cost with regard to logistics is night and day different, and that's why many U.S. retailers have failed right out of the gate, trying to enter either Canada or, in fact, trying to enter the U.S.
You know, a lot of people.
It's not just a U.S.-Canadian phenomenon.
And with the Nordstrom deal in particular, you've got one of these flagship locations, and you referenced Sears' own experience at the Eaton Center in downtown Toronto. A lot of people across this country, anyone who visits Toronto as well, will be familiar with that location. And at this point in time, given where the retail industry is, if Nordstrom leaves after Sears had left, one wonders who wants a location like that. We have actually asked a lot of guests over the last few days about this, including Ian Rosen from the Harry Rosen team, longtime retail analyst Dana Telsi as well. I want to share with our audience some of what they had to say and then get your reaction.
Sure.
Is there a role for a department store in the marketplace? Absolutely, but they have to maintain relevance, and that's the challenge that all of us as retailers, especially with the proliferation of online, especially with the proliferation of direct-to-consumer business, are challenged with.
There are other concepts, some of them which are not yet in Canada. The focus on activity, for example, Dick's Sporting Goods and some of the new initiatives that they have with new concepts where they'll have a baseball field or batting cages. I'm seeing activity-based formats becoming very attractive.
Right. So, Mark, when you hear that and I ask you the question, could someone fill this void of a huge department store opportunity at a flagship mall property? I heard the word relevance there, and stores becoming more concept oriented, I guess more than just selling goods. What do you make of that, and what's your own view?
Well, in all due respect to Ian and Dana, both of whom I know, I think they're really talking about apples and oranges. The department store, as classically defined as a multi-classification emporium selling all sorts of things, is a channel that's been declining for many, many years. Business has been siphoned off to specialists, and business has obviously been siphoned off to e-commerce. The problem with the Eaton Center is its size and the composition of its traffic. It's an overlarge, very impressive, very attractive space, but in reality, not to invoke any kind of hostile remarks from folks who hear what I have to say. I did live in Canada, just a few blocks away from the Eaton Center for about 4 years. At the end of the day, it's a transit hub. And though it is an enormous tourist draw, it doesn't have a residential community that surrounds it as Yorkdale, for example, does. And so for a classic upmarket department store like Nordstrom, trying to sell a lot of apparel and accessories, the draw is somewhat specious. And of course, the space is over the top. The square footage is far too great for the potential volume that can be done in that space. And that's the flaw of the Eaton Center, in my opinion, generally speaking. It's frankly too big.